This week's lectures are on communication and the self. This chapter will help us understand how we relate to others and ourselves as we communicate. Communication plays a huge role in how we perceive ourselves. So, messages that we get from others impact how we perceive ourselves as people. And those messages impact the way that we talk to others. So, understanding ourselves is a huge part of understanding how we communicate. This week's reading is chapter 2, which is about communication and the self. I love that we start our chapter, our unit, our work this semester with not just understanding others, but understanding ourselves. In order to be competent and effective communicators, we need to understand who we are before we can do that. We'll talk about self-concept, which is the way that we understand ourselves. Attribution, which is attaching meaning to behavior. We will pause for a hot take on gender. We'll talk about emotional IQ, identity management, and perception checking. The book, which I know all of you will read, has a brief blurb on the importance of names and naming in this chapter. So I'll be telling you the promised story, not that exciting, of how I changed my first name and why, and then, of course, relating it back to the concepts of the chapter. We will start this unit by first talking about this idea of the self-concept. We all have a self-concept, regardless of what that is. And it's this stable set of perceptions that you hold about yourself. Sometimes these things can waver, but generally your self-concept is something that you believe pretty consistently. The book has this really cool free writing exercise. I encourage you to take a look at it and do it along with me. But it asks you to think about some of your characteristics, things related to you. So some of your physical characteristics. Are you short? Are you tall? What do you look like? Do you have any physical disabilities? Are you an athlete? What kind of athlete are you? Social traits. These might be these are the ways that you interact with others in social situations. Are you really extroverted and bubbly at a party? Or are you the type of person that finds the cat right away and spends the evening petting somebody else's cat? Are you really outgoing? Are you really helpful? Are you a good listener? Those are all of your social traits. Social roles are the roles that you play in society related to other people. So some of the social roles that I play are obviously instructor of communication. That's a social role that I have in relationship to all of you. But being an instructor, educator, faculty member also plays out in other areas of my life. For example, I'm doing a project at my full-time job where I'm going to be helping other people write better as they're communicating with customers and potential customers. So that takes my social role as an educator over here and puts it in a different context. Things that you're interested in definitely are parts of characteristics of yourself that can get a bit deeper. So if I tell you, as I talked about earlier in my sample speech, I have a big interest in outdoor activity and lakes in particular. That really plays into who I am as a person more deeply because I care about the natural environment. And then you have talents, things that you're really good at, and beliefs. So these might be your political or your religious or your philosophical conviction. So if you share whatever political viewpoint it is, so let's say that you're a conservative, that conservatism, that small government, individual responsibility is going to play a really big role in how you see yourself, the type of actions that you take, and then how you interact with others. So those are all of the characteristics of yourself. And these all lead to this self-concept, which is this stable set of perceptions that you hold about yourself. That's different between self-concept and self-esteem. Self-esteem goes along with self-concept, but it's this personal evaluation of your self-worth. So you could hold a negative belief about yourself based on some characteristics. Let's go back to social traits. Let's say that you are the person that goes and finds the cat at the party, of course, once parties become a thing again. You're the person, you go find the cat, you hang out in the corner with the cat or the dog. And honestly, that's what I do at parties, because if I tell people I teach public speaking, they're like, bye. No, I'm going to go talk to literally anybody else at this party. But that might not make you feel good about yourself. You might feel like you should be more outgoing or conversational. You might have gotten messages from parents or other people in your life that said, you really need to be a little bit more social and not just find the cat at the party. So that can lead to lower self-esteem. So your self-esteem is this personal evaluation of your self-worth. It's based on your self-concept, which are the stable set of perceptions that you hold about yourself. And of course, communication plays a huge role in our self-concept. We learn about the world through communication. So obviously, these two things are really connected. The book talks about significant others. I generally use this term to refer generically to a person with whom you have an ongoing romantic relationship, but the book calls it the person whose opinion you value. So I'm going to start using the term partner instead. And yes, he's a significant other in my life. I do value his opinion. So the significant other is going to be any person whose opinion you value. This can be, well, hopefully it's anybody you have a romantic relationship with, but it can be your friends, siblings, other family members, parents tend to play a huge role here. Your boss. I value my boss's opinion. Faculty members, professors, instructors. Those might be people whose opinion you value only for the semester, or you might have a higher value of that person, especially if it's somebody you take classes with over and over. Coaches can be significant others in your life as well. And anybody you interact with, like a mentor, whose opinion really matters to you. Through those significant others, we get this reflected appraisal, and that helps us build our self-image based on how others view you. Let's say that you grow up in a family that really values extroversion. They might not all be extroverts, but they really value large groups, chaos, everybody talking to everybody, running around, those kinds of things. And you're the type of person who finds the cat at the party, or you're the type of person who finds the other person finding the cat at the party, or you're the kind of nerd that finds the other nerd at the party. And you and I sit here in the corner with the cat having a conversation about whatever obscure topic it is, while everybody else is watching the football game. If you're raised in that kind of family where they think that you should be watching the football game and excited about that, and here you are over here in the corner with your nerdy friend, and you're talking about different philosophies of Supreme Court justices and how this latest nomination is going to shake up the court because you want to hang out with your nerd friend, that might not reflect well on you in that family. So even though you really are happy with that decision and you want to, hang out with the cat, talk about the nerd stuff, your family might wish that you were there watching the football game instead. So you might feel negatively based on that. Conversely, you could be really excited and extroverted, and you want to stand there with the group of people watching the football game, getting angry when pass interference isn't called or whatever it is, and your significant others are the people that are standing together in the kitchen having an in-depth conversation about Supreme Court jurisprudence. You might then feel negatively and awkward based on that. But reflected appraisal can also help you develop your self-esteem and your self-confidence. For example, when I was younger, I was kind of like a chunky nerd and no coordination. My parents were like, having you play sports is a waste of our time. You are not good at athletic activity. You have no business doing this. You will be picked last in gym class for the rest of your life. So growing up, I always thought, I'm completely unathletic. I have no skills, no talent in this area. But I got older, I started trying more things, found activities that I really liked, and started to feel more confident. And then I joined my gym. And I joined my gym through somebody at my yoga studio. And she really believed in my potential in the weight room. So I show up, I start lifting, and I find, holy crap, not only do I like this, but I'm pretty damn good at it. So I decide that my new goal in life is to get swole. And I go to the gym and I keep lifting, and I get this reflected appraisal that I'm really strong in the weight room. Not just that, but I've got good skills and I'm good at the lifts and I take coaching well and I'm there to improve. And through that, I felt confident to try things like an in-house powerlifting meet. And now I've moved up into the gym's advanced class. So their reflected appraisal has helped me develop a self-image of myself as a good athlete and a weightlifter. Get your tickets. The self-fulfilling prophecy goes on with the reflected appraisal. And that's an expectation of an outcome that influences behavior towards that outcome. So if I'm going into my powerlifting tournament and I think, I have no idea what I'm doing, I am a terrible lifter, I have no business being here, you can psych yourself out. But if I go in and I'm like, yep, I know what to do, I know how to squat, I know how to bench, and I know how to deadlift. You could wake me up at 3 a.m, give me a warm up, and I could execute a proper deadlift. Then I know that I've got the self-fulfilling prophecy. My behavior is going to influence that outcome. This could also happen in just conversational, in a personal context. Let's say that you are interviewing for a job and you think, no way, I'm underqualified for this. I can't believe they gave me an interview. The way you're going to answer those questions in the job interview isn't going to be as strong as if you believe that you really belong there. So your expectations of an outcome influence behavior towards that outcome, positive or negative. Other influences on our self-concept, mass media, and culture. So these are really broad, but mass media influences how we feel about ourselves because we see different images reflected in the media. So if I see an image of a female athlete that doesn't match what I look like, I might think that there's no way that I can be an athlete. Especially if that athlete is perhaps a gymnast who definitely trains differently than somebody who lifts. The bodies are going to look completely different. The other part of this can be culture. So different cultural expectations that you receive about whatever it is. So if you're growing up in a culture that sends certain messages about gender, for example, you're going to take and receive that information differently, which might affect the way that you see yourself. Communication plays a huge role in our self-concept. We look to other people to help influence that self-concept, whether for good or bad. And we develop that self-image based on how other people view us, which is that reflected appraisal. Then we get our self-fulfilling prophecy. So thinking about that expectation influences your behavior to see if that thing will happen or whether it won't. Now that we've talked a bit about our self-concept, let's talk about understanding the behavior of others. Attribution is the process of attaching meaning to behavior. So we attribute behavior to certain causes, whether that's our own behavior or other people's behavior. Then we have this thing called a self-serving bias. We judge our own behavior positively, other people's behavior less positively. I like to use driving examples for this. I know that if you have driven a car for, multiple times, you have made mistakes driving a car. Some of you may have gotten in accidents, driven distracted. I once drove my car down an ATV trail in the Arapahoe National Forest in Colorado. That was definitely a mistake. So all sorts of mistakes can happen with cars, but we attribute those mistakes differently. Let's say that I am driving down the road and I get cut off by a person and they have a bumper sticker for my gym's rival gym or my yoga studio's rival yoga studio. These are not rivalries that matter. Like, do your yoga, lift your weights. But I see that this person has the other yoga studio's bumper sticker on their car. And I think, oh, well, that's one of those yoga people, not one of my yoga people. And I might attribute that generally to this person being a jerk, when in reality, they might be a really good, safe driver, but it was raining and I drive a gray car and it kind of blends in and they didn't see me. And they genuinely didn't want to cut me off. And if I talked to them about it, would feel pretty bad about it. Meanwhile, if I'm driving and I cut somebody off, which has happened, that's a mistake. And I feel bad about it because I'm a good driver. And that's what I'm going to tell myself, that, yep, I'm good at driving anyway. And one mistake doesn't matter. So we attribute behavior based on things that we see. We're more likely to pay attention to negative versus positive impressions. So imagine that you are driving to an interview and you accidentally cut off the person who's interviewing you. That's a negative first impression, even if, again, it's a mistake. Maybe even they snuck up behind you and were driving too fast for the road that you are on. That's a negative first impression. And as you go into the interview, you might nail the rest of it, but that interviewer is going to pay attention to that negative impression a little bit more than those 10 kick-ass answers to the interview questions that you gave. Hopefully, that doesn't happen to you. And I don't want to make you paranoid about either driving or interviews, but these are ways that these attributions can happen. Conversely, we have this thing called the halo effect, which is where we overgeneralize positive qualities for somebody you like. And this can happen for people in our lives, or it can happen for celebrities. The halo effect means that if somebody says it, we're like, oh yeah, so-and-so is wonderful. Let's say that you have an uncle that you love and he's great and he makes you laugh and you just think that Uncle Bob is the most wonderful person ever. You are going to overgeneralize his positive qualities, but you might leave out that, he's got some road rage going on. You overgeneralize the positive qualities for people that you like. And then we tend to gravitate towards the familiar. We gravitate towards people that are similar to us. And sometimes we can attribute negative behavior to people who are different from us when it wouldn't matter. If we go back to the getting cut off example, let's say that person had a political bumper sticker that I disagreed with, rather than just the yoga studio across town. That's going to really impact the way that I interpret their behavior. Because that person is an other to me. They're not just an other, but they're somebody that has a view that I actively dislike. I'm going to attribute more negative behavior to that person. Whereas if the person cut me off and they had a bumper sticker that I did agree with, or pro cats on their car, I might gravitate towards them a little bit more, say, well, okay, life happens, cats are great, and that's how this works. So we gravitate towards the familiar. We have that halo effect where we overgeneralize people that we like. And overall, communication, we use that to attach meaning to behavior, which helps us build that self-concept about how we're interacting in the world. The book takes a minute to drop some hot takes on gender and communication in this unit. This is a big topic. Gender, sex, sexuality, gender identity, huge topic. If you want to learn more, take the gender and communication class. I'm going to give you all basically the TLDR on sex, gender, and communication. First thing we need to understand, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before, is the difference between sex and gender. When we talk about sex, we're talking about biological characteristics. So this might be male, female, what parts does the person have, what sexual organs, what secondary sex characteristics, those kinds of things. This seems to be kind of a dichotomy between male, female, but there's also people who have transitioned. They're going to have different sex characteristics, and people who are intersex, which means they have physical characteristics that are associated with both men and women. So sex is biological, whereas gender is about social constructs and expectations. You might see social constructs and expectations for people who are gendered as male, being tall, being strong, boys don't cry, those kinds of things. Social expectations of men, social expectations of people who are gendered as female might be that they're very caring and nurturing and pleasant. These social constructs and expectations make up how we talk about gender, but not necessarily sex. This gets complicated. The book calls it the gender matrix, and it's a mix of qualities. The thing you need to understand is that people are complicated, and everybody has their own relationship to sex and gender. Some people are even like, yo, no thanks, non-binary, whatever that might be, whatever that might mean to them. People are complicated. They can have all sorts of different views, experiences, perspectives on this issue. A lot of these social expectations are getting pretty outdated. I feel like even in the time that I've been teaching communication classes, this has completely changed. I think for a lot of you who are traditional freshman age students, you would be shocked if you went back 10 years and did college, at the same time that I did, even at an institution very similar to Edgewood. Totally different gendered expectations. And I think it's great. I love how open we're all getting in many ways of screw your expectations. I'm going to do the things that make me happy and that reflect who I really am. The other thing that you want to know is that people exhibit different gender qualities based on context. So a person might identify or act differently in a romantic relationship. They might take on some of those roles or get rid of some of those roles in a relationship, depending on the gender configuration of that relationship. Whereas that person might act very differently in a work context or a friend context. So those gender qualities can really vary based on context, and people are complex, and everybody is. Everybody's got their own complicated relationship to sex and gender. So it influences our communication. It influences our communication way more than we can get into in this 5-minute slide. People are complicated. Sex is biology. Gender is social constructs. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, but it's not over. Go to the next slide. Let's talk about emotional IQ. Emotional IQ is the ways in which we are emotionally competent, and this affects the way that we communicate with others. First, let's talk about empathy and sympathy. And if you get these confused, don't worry, you're not alone. I do it all the time as well. Empathy is this idea of comprehending and sharing another person's perspective. So this is really looking at how that person feels while you're talking to them. Right now, for example, I have a cat who would like to participate in this lecture. Some of you might have had pets, cats, dogs, or maybe other members of your household. If you live with small children, this could apply. And you might be feeling a lot of empathy for me right now because you've had a pet or another member of your household get in and interrupt what you're trying to do, especially if that's in a professional environment. So, thank you, Ms. Kitty. You are dismissed now. That's empathy. It's comprehending and sharing another person's perspective. Sympathy is feeling compassion for that. Let's say that you've never had a pet interrupt what you're trying to do, or a family member, sibling, etc. You might feel sympathy for that, but you wouldn't be able to necessarily understand that person's perspective. Sympathy is more about compassion. Empathy is about understanding and sharing perspectives. And you can empathize without having sympathy. For example, if I am at a store and I see somebody giving the retail worker a really hard time, maybe the Target is out of throw pillows, I can empathize with the frustration of that person who really wants to buy those throw pillows, but I don't have a lot of sympathy for them. I don't have a lot of compassion because, I mean, throw pillows are fun. I own a few myself, but they're not really an important item. They're in the scheme of things right now, especially in our global pandemic, this isn't the thing that you may want to be frustrated about. So I might not feel a lot of sympathy for that person. But I could feel empathy that they are frustrated and that they can't find this thing that they want to buy. But I can also empathize with the retail worker. Having worked in retail and dealt with angry customers, I can definitely understand what that person is going through. And I can also feel some sympathy for them, some compassion for the person who is taking their frustration out on the retail worker. And if I take another step back and think about it, I can probably also feel sympathy for the customer who can't find their pillows. Not because the person can't find their pillows. No sympathy there. But you can tell that that person is frustrated. Maybe other things are going on in their lives, or, maybe they just watch the news and they're seeing a lot of bad and scary and awful things happen, and they're frustrated. And this one thing that they feel like they should be able to control. Does the Target have these darn throw pillows? They can't control. And so that frustration comes out in that interaction. So emotional IQ is understanding where these feelings might be coming from. Emotional intelligence means that we can manage our own emotions and work with others. There's a couple of ways that we can look at this. The first one is self awareness. So being aware of how you're reacting to a situation. When let's say that I'm observing that situation in the Target with the throw pillows and the poor Target employee who's like 17 and just wants to get out of there. I think of myself as my own self as a 17-year-old retail worker who is just not about your BS and wanted to earn my paycheck and go to college. So I'm putting myself in that situation. I bringing my own views about materialism and purchasing and retail into that interaction as I'm analyzing it. Self regulation is this idea that we regulate the way we can respond. So I might see that interaction and want to just give that person a dirty look, call them a name, maybe call them a Karen, and want to take out my anger and frustration about, the general state of the world on that interaction. But self-regulation means that I'm like, okay, I'm going to go through the Target. I'm going to buy things I don't need, maybe buy the things I do need and get out of here. Internal motivation is this motivation that we have internally to develop our emotional IQ. And it's something that we can definitely develop, just like competence can be learned. A lot of these things are skills that can be learned. So you have an internal motivation to reflect and develop these skills and perhaps read more about emotional IQ and emotional skills, go to therapy, whatever it is that makes you a little more emotionally aware. Again, practicing empathy is a good way to practice emotional intelligence and developing that skill of empathy, being able to comprehend and share and understand another's perspective just a little bit more. And then finally, good old fashioned social skills. We're going to have to dust these off at some point. Being sociable and comfortable and competent in some of these social situations. Emotional IQ brings all of these things together and helps us interact with others in a way that's a little more productive and healthy for everyone. But before we move off of this slide, I want to bring us back to our definition of communication competence and understand that while communication competence is situational, emotional IQ is also situational. And we have people who look at emotional situations from a variety of different perspectives. And this can be anything from personal experience to neurodivergence. Emotional IQ looks different in everybody. It's situational and it's skills that can be adapted and used. Next, we're going to talk about identity management. Identity management is a series of communication strategies that are used to influence how other people view you. Before we go any further, identity management is not dishonest. It's a good thing and we all do it. With that in mind, let's just I'm going to take this moment to give you a brief example of how I'm managing my identity right now. You can see that obviously I'm lecturing from home, but I have done a pretty good job of cleaning up the things behind me. If, for example, I were to leave that closet open, uh, we might have a different impression of my identity. That's where I shove all my junk. So I've got that door closed. I've also thought about the background that I have, and I've set up kind of a little cozy, homey background. So I've got my reading chair, I've got my books, and if we look closely, a throw pillow with a cat. Oh, yeah, this lecture just referenced itself. I'm setting up an identity right now that's presenting a professional image. I mean, I generally don't sit around my house wearing blazers, gonna be quite honest with you, but casual and approachable. This isn't a bad thing. In fact, it's a useful tool for me as a communicator because I want to communicate an image to you that's friendly, casual, and approachable, but also formal in some ways. Other ways that I'm managing my identity are um, watching my language. There should not be any profanity in these slides. That's the second half of the semester. We'll talk about profanity at some point. But I'm making sure that I'm using more formal language while I'm talking to you. All of these things are part of identity management, and they're things that we do every single day. So don't think that identity management is a bad thing. In fact, I would argue that we're always managing our identities in some small way. We have different selves, as the book calls it. So our public versus private self. And we have our perceived versus presenting self. So public versus private is who we are when we're in public versus private. And I would argue that right now I'm actually presenting you my public self. Even though this is my own personal home, as evidenced by the kitty, I'm presenting a public self because this is my work self. And when I'm working from this desk, whether I'm working my full time job or working with all of you, that's kind of public. It's a little more intimate, it's a little more private. It's definitely still public. My private self is what happens when I shut down the 3 computers on this desk and walk away from work. That's when I go out into my living room, my kitchen, interact with my partner, interact with friends over WebEx, Zoom, FaceTime, carrier pigeon, whatever that might be. That's more my private self. And that's where I would behave differently. I might walk around in my gym shorts or use more profanity. And I guarantee you, I definitely do both of those things. That's private self versus public self. They both have a place. But then our perceived and presenting self are also elements of that. So our perceived self is who you believe that you are in those private, honest moments. I like to call this the shower thought. So what are your core fundamental beliefs about yourself. And that could be anything from positive thoughts to negative thoughts, traits about yourself, whatever it might be. But your presenting self is how you want to seem to others. And when we get a disconnect between our perceived self and our presenting self, we have some issues. Let's say that a person perceives themselves as being really brave and willing to stand up for themselves and others, but presenting self, an opportunity arrives where somebody makes a racist comment at work and that person doesn't respond to it. So they perceive themselves as being somebody that would stand up to that comment. In that presenting time, you maybe don't. So there's that friction there. Your presenting self is how you want to seem to others, but we don't always make it there. Finally, we have face work, which are verbal, nonverbal ways that people try to maintain a positive image. And I talked about a lot of the face work that I do uh, right now. This is a lot of face work to make sure that I'm maintaining the image that I want to maintain as an instructor. When I go and maybe FaceTime a friend, I'm going to maintain a totally different image to that friend. It'll still be me underneath, but there's a lot of things that I don't have to do to present that image when I'm talking to a friend. And while I realize that a lot of these examples are me focused, these things are going to be true for all of you as well. And you might be sitting around going, oh, yeah, I get that. I've done that before. You might have a different identity or face work that you use at work, especially if you're a healthcare worker. So you're a CNA or something like that. You're going to maintain a different positive image while you're working than you would maybe with your friends. Or if you're working in retail, like face work, here you go. And again, none of these things are dishonest. And they're actually, in my opinion, signs of good communication competence. I believe that you would take me less seriously if I showed up in my fleece, like my hair piled on top of my head like this, my sweaty gym clothes, my dirty shoes laying out over here on the floor. You might take me less seriously. I wouldn't come across as competent, and we wouldn't get as far in this class. It'd be awkward for you, awkward for me. So this is a way for me to present myself in a way that drives our class objectives forward. But when I'm talking to a friend on FaceTime, maybe, sitting in that chair right there, there's a lot of these things that I wouldn't do and I would act differently. And that would help me connect with that friend. So, face work, how we maintain our positive image, identity view management, strategies used to influence how people view us. We all do it, and it's a good thing. Now that we've talked about the definition of identity management, let's talk about a few characteristics. The first thing we need to know is that identity management is collaborative. You might think, well, this is my identity. I'm going to manage it on my own. Thank you very much. But if the people around you aren't participating in that identity management, it can be really difficult for you to have and manage that identity. And we can see this in a variety of different ways. So I'm going to choose a few examples, some that range from very basic to really profound and important for people's lives. So, one that might be really basic is you have an identity as somebody who loves to bake. My friend Lily loves to bake. And I love the fact that Lily loves to bake. Let's make this real. But part of the way that we collaboratively manage that identity is that Lily bakes cookies, drops them off here, and I enjoy them. And then I give her back the tin. I'm like, hey, I just want to make sure that you have this tin back in case you need to refill it with cookies. And I hand that back. We collaboratively manage Lily's identity as a person who likes to bake. Identity management can also relate to things like competence. So, if my identity is as somebody who is very competent and good at their job, and the people that I'm working with treat me in a way that doesn't reflect that, maybe talking down to me or explaining basic concepts or not assuming that I can handle certain tasks, then my identity management doesn't work as well because I'm managing my identity as somebody who is capable of doing these things, and the people I'm working with are not. This can show up in a variety of different ways that can be associated with discrimination. So now we're getting into things that are a little more serious than lily baking cookies. For example, race or gender can factor into these things. So we might see somebody and be like, oh, this person isn't really great at their job. And we that can subconsciously be connected to race or gender in a case where, oh, this is a female software engineer. Eh, we might assume that she's not as good at her job. And again, these are subconscious expectations. Sometimes these are conscious expectations. But that identity management isn't becoming collaborative. Age can also be a factor here in multiple directions. There might be a person who's really good with new technology, but they're older and people aren't assuming that they're good at that new technology. Or you might have somebody who appears to be very young and we don't assume that they're particularly mature based on that, the way that they look, and what that identity looks like. So we have to participate in this collaborative identity management. And if we want to get even more serious, I think we see this a lot with uh, the queer community. And if a person comes out and says, well, I'm non binary, I use they, them pronouns, these are the only pronouns that I use, and I want you to refer to me in this way, and I want you to think about me in this way, if the people around them don't participate in that management and continue to refer to that person as a he or a she, then that person's identity isn't respected in that group. We, as a group, have to collaborate to respect that person's identity, make sure that they are seen as a they. So, identity management is really a group activity. We all have to agree on how we're managing these identities. Now, the next thing is that people do have multiple identities. People are, obviously complex, and a lot of the things that I talked about in the last bullet point would apply here. So you have multiple identities across race, gender, sexuality, income level, whatever that might be. Again, intersectionality, all of these things combine, but people do have multiple identities that they're managing at any one time. Identity management can be deliberate or unconscious. So obviously, like I deliberately put all the stuff in all the junk in the closet. I deliberately wore more formal looking clothes, but unconsciously, there are some other things that I'm thinking about. I've got my kind of professor voice hat on. I generally don't talk like this to people normally. So I'm kind of unconsciously and kind of consciously managing that identity. People differ in how much identity management they do, and this differs based on the context as well. So I wouldn't say that you're always a low or always a high self monitor. A high self monitor pays close attention to their behavior and others' reactions. This is something that you would often see in a professional workplace. So, if you're working in healthcare, you want to be a high self monitor, really paying attention to patients' behavior and their reactions, and then modifying your communication with that patient if needed. Low self monitors express thoughts without thinking as much about their behavior. So, this is really good if you're with your friends or you're with uh, family or an intimate partner that you trust and care about. Let it go. The moment that I leave this room to go make myself lunch, I'm going to switch from being a high self monitor to a low self monitor because I'm making lunch in my own house versus recording lectures for students. It's knowing when you need to be a high self monitor and a low self monitor. Our roles influence identity management. I'm going to keep going back to my role here. My role is to be the educator, to be the expert, to lead the class. That's going to impact the way that I manage my identity in front of all of you. When I leave here and I go hang out with my friend right over there on FaceTime, and he and I are chatting, my role is to be a friend, and then I'm going to act differently. And then finally, identity management can be goal oriented. And this is a good thing. So right now, I'm managing my identity with a goal to communicate this information in a relatable, digestible, and educational way. If I go to a job interview, I'm definitely doing some identity management because my goal is to get the job or to find out if the job is a good fit for me and not take it if it isn't. If you're on a date, you're going to manage your identity in a different way. If you're with your family, you're going to manage your identity in a different way depending on what your goals are with that interaction. And this can even be, you can manage your identity differently and your presentation and yourself differently with different people. So if I'm having a really like joking, fun conversation with my partner, I'm gonna manage my identity differently and act a little differently than if we're sitting down and talking about, okay, so we have to buy a new car. What does this look like? Then I'm gonna bring my more serious face and a spreadsheet. I'm very fun. This identity management is goal oriented because I'm really focusing us and focusing this conversation on this important thing that we have to do, buy a car, and less fart jokes and pizza for dinner, which is what happens outside of this room. And those are your characteristics of identity management. Here it is, our last slide. And of course, we have to talk about social media because, duh. Let's talk about identity management on social media, which is where I'm sure a lot of you are practicing identity management. And I'm sure as you listen to those previous lectures, you thought, oh yeah, yep, that affects what I post on Instagram. Yep, I see what you're doing there. So identity management and social media. The book cites a study that certain kinds of identity management can actually boost self-esteem. Having conversations with people that you don't live close to, staying in contact on social media can boost your self-esteem. We also find research shows that being genuine matters. If you are not yourself on the internet, then the interaction seems very fake. So being genuine on social media really impacts your self-image and your identity. If we build self-esteem, we enhance that emotional resilience, so we feel a lot better about ourselves. A couple of other hot takes that I want to talk about are photo editing. And this is my own personal hot take. I think photo editing is the main form of identity management that we practice on social media. If not, maybe not the main one, but a big one. Think about all of the photos that you have thrown out because you don't like the way you look. Oh, I've got like 4 chins in that photo. Bye. Or that's an unflattering angle. Or there's part of that photo. Oh, that's a really cute photo of my cat, but it also shows my pile of socks over here, and I don't want to put that on Instagram. And I can't get the little square to also show the cat and not show the socks. Delete. So photo managing is a really big part of managing our identity. It's how we filter, crop our photos, if you have Photoshop skills, how you Photoshop them, and the photos that you choose to share. The other scary part of identity management is other people posting pictures of you. And I'm sure we've all had an experience where somebody posted a picture of us and we did not like it at all. So that's identity management, to work and manage your identity socially with that person to say, yo, I don't like that picture. I'm not comfortable with that being up. Delete it, please. We do a lot of consistent identity management on social media. I really think that social media is about, I don't know, we'll say 80% cats and 20% social identity management. And even then the cat can be part of identity management because I want to share this cat instead of sharing other more personal things about me. Honestly, if you ever followed me on Instagram, and you won't because my profile is hidden, I don't post anything. But if I do, it is the cat, it is the dog, it is the outside, or me lifting heavy things. Apparently, that's all I do with my life because that's the way I've decided to manage my identity on that social network, which is a very narrow margin of who I am. With that, we have finished our week 8 lectures on chapter 2. Do make sure that you go read the textbook, follow along with that. Of course, make sure that you are doing your journals and your blog posts. If you are behind on any of those, make sure that you get those in as well. And start thinking about the ways that identity impacts how you interact with the world and how you interact with others. Because I think applying these theories to your own personal life is going to help you understand not just the theories, but your life as well. See you later. Oftentimes, when we see behavior in others, we jump to conclusions or assumptions, and you know what happens when we assume. Wink. Perception checking is a way to counter some of those assumptions. The idea of perception checking is that we see a behavior, we jump to conclusions, and then take a step back and reanalyze that behavior in a more communicatively competent way. I'm going to go through the steps of perception checking, talk about some of the benefits, and then provide an example that I'm sure will be familiar to many of you. First thing we do when we are perception checking is to just simply describe what we're seeing in a very neutral way, maybe a little supportive or positive, but generally this is behavior that we don't like when we're perception checking. Describe what you're seeing and then offer 2 possible interpretations for the behavior. And again, we want to go neutral in this area. A possible interpretation for behavior isn't, you're a jerk. Don't do that. And then ask the person for some clarification on how to interpret what you're seeing in a assertive, friendly tone. Perception checking allows us to understand others instead of jumping to conclusions, which allows us to address problems rather than making assumptions and creating conflict. Perception checking is also not defensive. It's very assertive, and we're not there to defend ourselves or put other people in a position to defend themselves. We're trying to work towards a greater understanding. Let's look at an example of perception checking. We're going to work through perception checking on a situation that I'm sure many of you have been in, even if you don't want to admit it. And that is a student falling asleep in class. And some of you are like, yeah, I've done that. And others of you may not feel that way, or it may not have happened to you. But I'm going to talk through how I, as an instructor, would approach a student falling asleep in class using the perception checking method. This is, again, a common situation. I've had students fall asleep in class on me, and I have definitely fallen asleep in class myself. I would like to handle it better than my high school English teacher did, who, after observing that I had completely checked out, walked up to me and yelled something in my face, and I abruptly woke up and paid attention for the rest of class. Now, if I'm standing up here teaching a class, there are a couple of common interpretations that I might have about a student falling asleep in class. I might think that they're disrespectful, that they're bored, or that I'm boring. And as we think about this situation, we'll find that a lot of these things aren't always necessarily the case. If I'm going to approach this student about falling asleep in class, I'll start by describing the behavior. And again, I'm going to do that in a really neutral way. And I'll say to the student, hey student, we're going to name our student Bob. Hey Bob, I see you've been falling asleep in class. You can hear on my tone that it's not mean, it's not accusatory, it's assertive and direct and pretty non-confrontational. I'll offer a couple of potential interpretations. Are you having some problems outside of class, or any problems with the class that you want to talk about? And then I'll ask for clarification on how to interpret the behavior. And I'll do this through expressing concern for Bob by saying, I'm concerned about you. What's going on? So again, I'm not accusing Bob of anything. We're doing this in a very neutral, supportive way. There are so many reasons that a student would be falling asleep in class, and I'm sure you can list many of them. Medical reasons, personal stress. The student might be bored, but that could be because they took the same class in high school and all of the material is review. The student might be working an obscene number of hours, which is why I fell asleep in my high school English class, because I was working an obscene number of hours and then trying to manage AP classes. And some of you are like, I'm in this picture and I don't like it. Or perhaps that student just stayed up late playing video games. I'm not here to judge, but what I am here to do is work with that student towards a better outcome. If I tell the student that I want to help them, we're going to work towards a better outcome. Now, it might be that the student, we'll pick on Bob here, he stayed up late playing video games. He just made a mistake, to be honest with you, and he's tired, and that's why he's falling asleep in my class. But Bob might have a medical condition that makes him really tired, or he might just naturally get tired around the time of day where we have class. Or Bob could have taken a similar class in high school, and therefore he's bored. There are different ways that I can work with Bob to improve his situation in our class. If he's really tired, I might suggest that he stand up in the corner where he's not distracting anybody, but it's harder for him to fall asleep, obviously, if he's standing up. Gives him something a little more engaging to do with his body to help him focus on the class. If it's a class he's already taken, I might find a way to give him some different, extra, more challenging material to make sure that he stays engaged. If there's something that we could do to connect him with resources and services at the college that are contributing to his problems, we can do that too. But by engaging in some perception checking with Bob, I can have a much better conversation with him and work towards our ultimate goal, which is to support all of our students as learners. Okay, here it is, your promised name change story. My parents gave me a name that I never cared for quite a few reasons. The first name, the long version of it, was long and flowery. The nickname, which is what I used, sounded terrible to me. And the middle name was also pretty crappy in my opinion. It was something I got picked on in school for growing up, and it was one word that I would never enunciate. We'll talk about enunciation later in the semester, but enunciation is the ability to speak clearly, so your listeners know what words you're saying. I was the captain of the speech team, and I enunciate pretty well. But my name was the one word that I would never say clearly. I'd mumble it out and even apologize for how terrible it was. Yes, it was awkward. I got many nicknames because people picked up on my discomfort. I believe I'm still in several phones as knitter, which is accurate. I do like to knit, but not what I want to put on my resume. For a long time, I knew that I wanted to change it and that I needed to change it. But it's a big change to make, and I was understandably nervous about doing it, and I couldn't pick one out. But when I turned 30, moved to Middleton, got my Costco membership, I decided to give this name change to myself as a present. I ended up keeping the short version of my original first name as my legal first name because it starts with a V, and I like the letter V because it's kind of a badass first initial. That's why you see that in my email address and my email signature. Then I decided to go by my middle name. I was lazy and I only had to pick one. I had 3 criteria for the name. I wanted it to be simple, neutral, gender neutral, and fairly unique, so not very common. I would pick out a couple of names from forums on the internet, subreddits, I'll be honest, and go to coffee shops and order a coffee under that name. If I liked the way it sounded when my name was called, I put it on the list. My coffee shop records in Madison are a hot mess, absolute mess. I also changed my Apple products to the new name when I got close to a contender. If you use Apple products, I'm a sheep, I do, you'll know that they really like to call you by your name. So, great way to test it out. In January of 2020, I picked one and I trotted down to the Dane County Courthouse where I filed a petition for a hearing of name change. Because in Wisconsin, in order to change your name for a reason that is not marriage or divorce, you have to go to an actual court hearing. In January of 2020, they looked at my paperwork, they stamped it, and they said, "Your hearing is scheduled for March 10th. Come on back." Well, so I did. Unmasked, unhand sanitized, unsocially distanced, and unaware. The judge looked at me, signed my paperwork, and I took my prize outside of the Dane County Courthouse. Really, it was just an excuse to wear my favorite suit. And I have my paperwork, and I start the process of actually changing things. It's the week before COVID shuts everything down, including classes at Edgewood. I barely get a driver's license in my new name when it really starts to hit the fan. And I can still change my credit cards and all of that, just takes a little bit longer. But my problem is telling people, because I had the great idea that I was going to tell people as I saw them in person. Womp, womp. I thought about making a social media post to explain the change because I had updated my name on all of my social networks. But I'm pretty shy about posting on social media. I post very little on Instagram, which again, you will not follow me on Instagram. I will not allow it. And even if you did, it would be very boring. So I just piecemeal told people as I messaged them or saw them from 6 feet away. "Hey, good to see you from 6 feet away. I changed my name. It's been a fun pandemic." So here we are. I'm recording this in January of 2022, and I'm really proud of myself for getting the year right. Nearly 2 years later, I want to share a couple of the class concepts that really apply to my story. The first one is self-concept. And let me tell you, after I got over the initial hump of telling people and feeling awkward about it, when I got to use my new name with no preamble and no introduction, I felt so confident and so good about myself. Played a huge role in my self-confidence and my self-esteem and how I value myself. A bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I had a positive attitude about it, and I practiced framing in the disclosure so that when I told people about it, I talked about it as if it wasn't a big deal. And I actually practiced my kind of spiel, my speech, my disclosure, the words that I was going to say and use to make that disclosure so that it felt more normal and not awkward and not uncomfortable. And it was framed in a way that was like, "Hey, here's an update. I'm using a new name. Update your stuff." Gender obviously played a bit of a role in this. By picking a more gender neutral name, I felt more comfortable with myself and my own relationship to gender and how that plays out in my life. It wasn't as flowery and feminine, which isn't me in my relationship to femininity and gender. Emotional IQ was something I really needed in handling people's responses because I got everything from, "That was a lovely first name. I don't know why you would change that," to, "Oh dang, that is a terrible name. Do you have a GoFundMe? I would like to contribute to your costs for getting rid of that name." I did not have a GoFundMe. So emotional IQ allowed me to respond to some of those comments, which were often based in other people's views and perceptions of me, as well as their own views and perceptions of things like gender. Identity management played a huge role in this. First of all, I had to remember who knew and who didn't. And that's a bit of identity management. I did a lot of high self-monitoring to observe how people were responding, but responded to them often in a way that indicated low self-monitoring, because I didn't really care in many ways how people felt about it. The paperwork is signed, here are the facts. One way that I still have to manage my identity around it is with my email address at Edgewood. You might be thinking, you could change that. And I could. However, if I change my email address from vweber@edgewood.edu to aweber@edgewood.edu, emails to the old address would only forward for 2 weeks. So if a student from a couple semesters ago wanted to get a letter of recommendation or had a follow-up question about their grade, that email would go straight to nowhere. And while I don't get a lot of emails from former students, I wasn't willing to sacrifice that continuity of email address to change it at Edgewood. So I still have my old name on my email address, and then I have to make this disclosure to people like all of you, like the students, every semester to explain that my email address isn't what you think it is. Overall, however, I am so glad that I did it. It is the best gift I have ever given myself. And I bought a new kayak this year. Last year, whatever. It's the best gift I've ever given to myself, and it's played such a huge role in my personal self-concept and how I perceive myself and how I communicate with others in the world, online, face-to-face, whatever it is. And that's what our entire unit is about. The way that we perceive ourselves affects the way that we communicate with others. I'm always happy to answer questions about it. If you're thinking of doing something similar or you know somebody that's done something similar, happy to answer questions. Please send me an email. I'm pretty open to talking about it. With that, our next slide is just a video of me playing with a cat, and this is the end of your lecture. I'll see you in class. Hey, buddy. Why did you have so many things to say earlier in the lecture? Can you say hi? Can you say hi up there? Oh, look at you. I know, I interrupted your nap. That wasn't very nice of me, was it? No. You had a lot of things to say earlier, and then you took a snooze. Okay, that's what you want to do. You love your chin scritches, don't you? Yes, you do. That's our show.